select board meeting at 6:30 in the Academy School gym. The meeting previously was convened at 5 o'clock, and we've been in executive session a couple of times since then to discuss personnel matters. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. As you know, we have a representative town meeting that is scheduled next Monday, June 2nd, to vote on a budget that was approved by the select board on, well, last Tuesday, I believe it was. And we're here this evening to walk through essentially the changes from the budget that was presented at and approved at our representative town meeting on March 22nd, which was then defeated by the referendum that was held, I think, on April 17th. What I'm going to do this evening is just walk through the considerations that we've looked at in preparing this new budget and explain the specific differences between this budget and the last, and then we'll take any questions that anybody has. After the budget was defeated at referendum in April, Select Board has probably met 6 times, I would guess, to develop the new budget. We began by looking at the broadest possible changes that could be made to the budget, including programmatic changes in the form of potential personnel cuts. And so we considered from the very earliest period taking out of the budget the money for the second part of the borrowing for the police fire facility. So the original budget had in it $261,473 for interest payments on borrowing $9 million towards the police fire facility. And so one item that was on for consideration was to take out that $261,000. In addition, we had proposals to consider cutting positions at library, parks and recs. We considered cutting the animal control officer position. We considered cutting winter snow removal on our sidewalks. There was no position at fire to consider cutting, and so that sort of survived without a specific cut targeted towards that department. During a series of meetings, including the meeting at the BAMS Middle School, where 150 or more people attended, I think we essentially heard from people that there's very little stomach for cutting services and cutting personnel. I can't promise in the future that that's not going to be on the table. We're going to have very difficult budget decisions to make, beginning just 2 or 3 months from now as we begin compiling the 2016 FY budget. But for these purposes, there was essentially not the votes after hearing from the people who came to our meetings to cut positions, except to a very small extent. Rather, we heard from many people who attended the meetings that they would prefer to see us try to cut percentages out of each department. 1%, 2%, 5% we had looked at when we were formulating the initial budgets. And so at our meeting 2 weeks ago today, we went through proposed 1% cuts in each department: town managers, finance, town clerk, general services, planning, library, assessors, fire department, police, dispatch, municipal center, public works, and parks and recs. And we spent about 2 hours discussing and going through each of the proposed cuts of 1% and what those would look like in these various departments. And in the handout that's been distributed tonight that says FY 2015 budget increases, reductions, that lists the cuts that we decided to make. before presenting this budget back to representative town meeting. So in addition to taking the interest out for the police fire facility, $9 million additional borrowing, we took out $50,000 in capital funds for sidewalks. That recognizes that we have $50,000 carryover from last year for sidewalks, and that there's also grant money that we're going to be receiving to rebuild the sidewalks already on the east side of Main Street. We cut out one of the 2 police cruisers that we had been intending to purchase, and that was included in the last iteration of the budget that was presented to representative town meeting. That throws us off the replacement schedule for cruisers. Cruisers generally should be replaced at 100,000 miles, and this does set us off that replacement schedule. It's deferred capital, but under the circumstances, we felt that that was something that the town could bear. We cut small amounts. It's been called nickel and diming, but that's what we were asked to do, from town clerks for working on land records. $1,500 from general services for the town report, $1,250 from planning for legal notices and postage, various items at the library for $6,100. At fire and police, we concluded that based upon different expected personnel changes over the course of the next year, the actual expenses were likely to be lower than originally anticipated. So we cut 18 and change from fire and 19 and change from police. We took out $2,000 from Parks and Recs for propane and cemetery maintenance. The one substantive cut beyond those that I've already talked about is that we did make a decision to cut the animal control officer position from 40 hours to 30 hours. We had initially discussed cutting that position altogether, and the potential for that position to be cut altogether had been on the table throughout the budget discussions that we had from October on. And so we ultimately decided to cut that position back 25% to 30 hours. That brought the budget to approximately 15.8, and we then had a discussion about whether we were going to recommend applying any of the undesignated unreserved fund balance to help defray the cost or the expenses of taxes and our revenues. And we got some good news at the last select board meeting when the finance director gave us the anticipated surplus or fund balance for the end of this year. And if everything works out as we currently hope and project, even with the additional expenses that we've had to incur this year, that include about $100,000 extra for road maintenance given the difficult winter, the approximately $50,000 extra we had to spend to move the communications tower from the top of Montostica Mountain over to the ski jump, right? Ski jump and the hospital, and then the funds to repair Elm Street and Depot Street after the floods of September 11th washed out Elm Street. We still anticipate about $200,000 surplus this year. Essentially, that $200,000 is the money that we raised this tax year in anticipation of paying off the entirety of the $14 million borrowing for the police fire facility. So we originally budgeted for FY13 that we were going to borrow $14 million, and actually we only borrowed $5 million. So the extra $9 million that we were going to borrow that we didn't, we raised money in taxes to pay the interest off of that, and that's about $200,000. And so what we've decided to do is to also recommend putting that $200,000 back into the budget. That will reduce the budgeted expenditures and the anticipated tax increase. So originally, the proposal was is a municipal tax rate of $122.40. And we've now brought that down to $117 and change, which means it's a 3.25 cent tax increase, which is a 2.87% increase over the 2014 municipal tax rate. So that's the budget that we're going to present at representative town meeting this coming Monday, June 2nd. We initially were not going to call this informational meeting because all of this has been done in a way in the public light over the course of the last 4 weeks. But this is the Jane Southworth Memorial Informational Meeting. Jane said you should have an informational meeting. So Jane says goes. So,
my fault.
If you have any questions about anything that's going to be presented at the meeting on this coming Monday, this is the opportunity to ask those questions. I will say that there has been some inquiry about what's going to happen to the police fire facility. And what the board decided through its discussions was that we needed to get a budget adopted so that we have a budget in place, if it's not rejected at referendum, for the beginning of the FY15 tax year, which begins on July 1st. It's my understanding that without a budget, we don't really have taxing authority. We have the ability to borrow, because you gave us authority to borrow at town meeting, but we can't tax without a budget in place. And we do not believe, here at the select board, that we are prepared yet to make a decision on the long-term fate of the police fire facilities renovation project. And so we have not yet made that decision at all. We've not had the full public process that will be necessary to get to another decision. So, as soon as this budget is passed, hopefully it will be passed on Monday, we will turn our attention back to the police fire facility, including determining what kind of process we're going to use and when a decision will be made. But for today's purpose, other than recognizing that the $261,000 in interest for the $9 million borrowing is no longer included, and that we're paying in this budget for the $5 million bond that we've already taken out, other than those two facts, we're not really talking about the police fire facilities this evening. It's not what's on the table, and it's not what's on for discussion on Monday. So I tend to think that questions that want to talk about the specifics of what's going to happen at police fire would sort of be out of order. And I don't like saying things are out of order, but that's not what we're talking about this evening. But anything about the budget, we're here to answer your questions. Is anybody on up here at the table have anything else that they want to say? Good. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Jane? Going once, going twice.
I was one of the 56 signers.
Yeah.
I was one of the 56 signers. I really thank you for your attention to working through this issue and being responsive to the problems that we face as the community that we are now. And I think I really want to thank the board a lot, and it makes me glad to be part of the community.
Any other questions, comments, anything about the budget? Ms. Will?
Marshall Wheelock, District 2. On page 2 of the handout, for under revenue, library donations. Could you explain what the source of that fund is, those funds?
Jerry can probably answer it easier than I can. Please.
That was added to the budget in the early stages of the budget preparation. We're launching an annual appeal this year, which will be the first time we'll be doing an annual appeal for basic operations, and that was part of that.
Thank you.
Any other questions about the budget or comments? Ms. Willow.
Thank you.
I'm sorry?
Thank you.
I have a question about the unassigned fund balance. And I was surprised that you chose to use this year in light of the pressures you're going to be facing next year. It seems that you're going to need it more next year than you need it this year.
I'll tell you my position, and then John, you go ahead first.
Well, in light of everything else that's been going on, my whole purpose was to definitely get the payments down as low as we could. John gave us some great news the other day. We went from a $1.7 million unassigned reserve fund to a projected 1.9. And that gave the board a little bit of breathing room. So we know that we're going to have problems next year. But I also feel that at the end of each year, we more than normally end up with a surplus. So not saying that that's going to happen this year, but we hope for that every year. So that's why I felt confident. I wanted $300,000. So I compromised at 2. I got shot down at 2 first, but then with John coming up with those figures, Mr. O'Connor, that it worked out. So we know that every year it's going to be a struggle, but I felt that it was necessary and it was important for the people of town to realize that we're working on this. And again, my whole reason for being on the board is to get the taxes as low as we can and to get business in town. So I really felt it was necessary to use. Mr. Gartenstein has a different view on that.
I initially was opposed to taking money from the unassigned fund balance, designated unreserved fund. But, and the reason why is that we have very, very substantial capital needs based upon long-term deferring of investment. The police fire is one example of a failure to invest over decades, which has brought us to a point where there's very substantial needs. We are aware that there's $450,000 in work that needs to be done at the municipal center. And going into last Tuesday's select board meeting, when we were going to approve this budget for presentation at the representative town meeting, I was going to oppose taking money, again, from the undesignated funds, from the savings account essentially, and say instead that really that money should be dedicated to capital in the long term, so that we have that money available to invest in capital projects that we've been able to build up a savings account. But the figures that John presented, that Mr. O'Connor presented at the last meeting, tended to indicate that not only are we hopefully not going to have to dip into the reserve fund to pay for the tower movement and for the Elm Street work, but also that there may be some additional surplus. Like I say, essentially the money that we borrow, that we tax ourselves to pay back for the anticipated borrowing on $14 million of borrowing. And under those circumstances, government is works best when there's compromise. And I certainly understood the position that Mr. Allen had been articulating for a long time, and people looking for tax relief. And we raised more money in taxes than we needed, and turning that money back in order to lower the tax rate seemed to make very fair sense, and that's why I changed my position. I saw in the back, Ms. Bosworth.
Yeah, Michael Bosworth, District 1. Just so I'm totally clear, so if we use that 200,000, if John O'Connor is correct about your projected figures for the end of this fiscal year, and we use 200,000, what will, and we will meanwhile pay for the communications and Elm Street, what will we be left with in the reserve fund?
Should leave us right about 1.7. Should.
Which is the standard, you know.
The 10%.
Yes, they would like us to have 10%. So the 10% is just a, you know, there's a lot of towns that have nothing in reserve. So we're trying to keep that as close as we can.
And you will have read in the paper that New Hampshire wound up with just $4 million, and they had to impose a hiring freeze last week, or this week, because they essentially ran out of money in the bank. That's as a state as a whole. Other questions? Ms. Stark?
Billy Stark, District 1. On page 2, the revenue side, fire insurance proceeds, I'm really disappointed here. $740 in 2013. And I'm wondering why, this maybe is for the fire department, but why do we not bill when we send our trucks out to, say, an accident on 91 where hazardous waste has been dumped and we have to help with cleanup? Or why Vermont statute says we can bill for that kind of stuff. I've looked it up. Why don't we?
Mike or Pete, if you can speak to that.
There is a revenue, there is a ordinance on the books. Fire department is allowed to bill. We bill for multiple false alarms at one building. If they don't take care of their alarm, we can bill for accidents on the interstate when we do extrication, technical rescues. We can recover costs. There's a list of things that we can bill for, and we do.
But they don't show up here?
They show up under outside revenue.
Commingled with the fire outside revenue.
So we're budgeted this year for $7,500 fire outside revenue, and that includes the money that we would recover off of the ordinance that allows for billing for services. Dr. Furlong, any question or comment?
Thank you. Bob Berlani, District 2. You mentioned the fact that you looked at the 1% across the board budget, spent 2 hours, but I didn't get a sense for what came of that meeting.
Well, all the items on the handout below capital running through Parks and Recs are the result of those 1% proposed cuts. We went through each, what happened is, in the original budget cycle, we asked the interim town manager to work with the department heads to tell us what 5% cuts would look like. And we went through all of those presented 5% cuts and selected the ones that we could live with. There weren't many. I mean, there were some very significant cuts that were proposed. This time, we asked them to narrow them down to 1% cuts, and even within those 1% cuts, there were things we could live with. For example, to get more cuts from the fire department, we would have had to cut the pay that goes to volunteers who were there to support the firefighters when we need extra personnel. To cut out of public works, we would have needed to cut, because the very lowest hanging fruit at Public Works is the twice-a-year line striping and safety equipment, traffic safety equipment that we put into the budget. So there were many of those that we didn't feel we could live with at this point. So these are the remaining 1% cuts running from town clerk through Parks and Recs, comes to, I don't know, $30,000, $50,000.
Thank you.
Ms. Davis?
I appreciate all the work that Chief Bocosi does, and the fire department is incredibly responsive, so I appreciate that. I was just looking at the budget for the fire department head, and just wanted some clarification, because I'm sure there is. It's on page 11, and what I was just noticing with 2013, 2014, 2015, and it looks like we budgeted in 2013 $72,000, but we actually paid $78,000. And then in 2014, we budgeted 74, and this year we're budgeting 78. So I'm just curious about the sort of the changes in that, and I'm sure that there's some explanation.
Before the prior town manager resigned her position, there was an adjustment of that salary line, and so that's reflected in the budget as it's brought up to current point.
So it was reduced, it was increased in 2013?
Was increased by a certain figure.
Right, and then...
I can tell you the exact figure if you want me to dig it out here.
Oh, no, I'm just noticing here it was 78 in terms of the actual, and then it went down in 2013, 14 to 74. It's on page 11.
I think it's the way in which it was budgeted as opposed to the actual.
Okay, great, thank you very much.
Sure. If there's no other questions, we'll Mr. Miller?
Roger Miller, I understand from your opening remarks that the original borrowing for the fire police was $5 million, and that is part of this proposed revised budget? Excuse me.
That's correct.
Okay, have we spent all of the $5 million?
No, we've spent $750,000 planning for the project. We were like 3 or 4 weeks away from getting documents that were ready to go out to bid.
And is there...
And we bought the Donnell property.
And there must be financing cost in here somewhere.
Well,
I mean, we would have had to pay, we have to pay interest on that $5 million that you borrowed.
Well, the $5 million was borrowed through the bond bank, and so we don't qualify for early repayment when you borrow through the bond bank. And so John could give us the exact figure of what we're paying this year for principal and interest on that $5 million bond that's got a 20-year life. And
there is a substantial amount of that $5 million is still, what, sitting in our bank account?
$4.25 million.
Are we getting interest on that?
I'm sure. It's not a ton. It's not in penny stocks.
Well, I understand that, but if you've only used a small portion of it, and the majority of it still sits in the bank, maybe that's enough to offset your interest cost.
I mean, prevailing interest rates are like the percentage on it.
I know, I have a small savings account.
Yeah, same here.
John, you want to say what the interest is?
If you don't, generally.
So next year's budget, we include the first principal payment on the $5 million bond, and that's $333,000. So that's an increase over this year. In addition to the interest, which my recollection serves me right, it's about $125,000. And the earnings on the $4 million, they're invested in very short-term government securities, and they earn nowhere near what the interest is on the bond.
but they're way secure. Mr. Dimes?
Kurt Dimes. I live in District 2. In response to Mr. Miller's question, I think the public and the select board should be aware that there is a very apt way that we can use that money which is sitting in the bank. Actually, we can use the $1.3 million of this to pay down the debt service on the other capital investments that we have outstanding, like the school and the water project and the parking garage. This plan, I have checked this plan out with John. I just mentioned it to John today. He says, sure, we can do it. And I've also spoken to Robert Giroux, the executive director of the State Bond Bank, and with the legal counsel to Brattleboro Common Sense, Paul Gillies. And I propose that with this $1.3 million taken out of the police fire bond and $300,000 from the unassigned fund balance, the budget could be reduced to around $14 million. The statute reads, I sent it to you by email some time ago, ladies and gentlemen. If after bonds have been issued and no expenditure of the proceeds has been made for the purpose or purposes for which the debt was incurred, or if the balance remains after the completion of the project or projects for which the debt was authorized, a municipal corporation, that's us, by a majority of the voters present and voting on the question at a meeting or meetings of such municipal corporation held for that purpose, may authorize the expenditure of the proceeds or portion thereof for any purpose or purposes for which bonds may be issued. This means that we can put the money towards other bonded expenses. And I think it'd be a great idea. We have without speaking to the merits of the police fire issue, it is in doubt and you are reconsidering it. It'd be sensible to take money out of that project, which is in flux and debatable, and put it into our expenses that we already have. And I'm sure Mr. Gillies or Mr. Giroux can speak to the board more about it. After we vote, if we vote on this, then the State Bond Bank Council would just verify that we are using the money properly for a bonded expense and that we are still able to pay back. This is really a good option. I'm afraid that the budget as it is pretty much the same budget as we had before. It's been reduced. It was approximately 16 million, and despite all your hard work, it was reduced to around 16 million. It's not really a big change that the people should have expected after their referendum. Thank you.
Any further comments or questions? Mr. Siegel?
I am Siegel, District 3. I'm just curious if there's somebody who can respond to what Mr. Miles just said. It seems to me if we were to use that money that way, we'd be paying down other obligations. So if we went back into the police fire project, we really be nowhere farther behind than we are now. My guess is the other obligations are at a higher rate. So I'm wondering if anybody can respond to just sort of the general logic of that proposal.
I was really hoping not to. First off, taking the money that's been borrowed by the bond is not warned as an article for this coming meeting. So it was a vote of a duly warned representative town meeting to borrow that money for a specific purpose, that was police fire. So although I am not the moderator of the town meeting, it would be my view that a vote at next Monday's town meeting to reallocate that money would not be procedurally correct because it's not been warned. That's number one. Number two, the obligation to pay back that money, principal and interest, over a 20-year period remains regardless of how we spend the money now. So we're going to be paying interest back on that money for the entire life, and principal for the entire life of that 20-year period. So spending that money now for a purpose other than for which it originally was borrowed seems to me to be a very foolish decision. But if it comes up at a properly warned representative town meeting, that's certainly something that representative town meeting could do. But I don't think that it's properly on the floor for this coming Tuesday's meeting. I don't want to have a debate about this one now. We can talk about it this coming Monday. And the moderator can make a decision about whether or not it's procedurally proper to vote on that at the time. Is there any other comments or suggestions? Questions? Dr. Torlani?
Torlani, District 2. I know it's going to be hard to figure this out, but we're also concerned about the safety issues in the fire department, police department, the structures. We really still don't know the cost, and it may be a while before we know what the cost of having to do essential stuff so we can keep our men and women safe. So that's what we need to figure out soon, because everything else is kind of, can't really do much until we know that. It's just such an important issue, and I think as soon as that is settled, that we'll all feel better knowing what to do with what money. Yeah.
And I think
We have to develop a budget and get it passed. We have to hire a town manager. We have to get pay-as-you-throw in place, and we have to do police fire. There's other things on the plate as well. We're working on them as quickly as we can. And we've been meeting every week and more. I agree totally.
Yeah,
Police fire needs to be done.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're probably going to continue to meet a lot more than we typically do because these things are pressing. And we're not going to hesitate at all. The committee will get to work and they'll have a proposal, and as quick as they do, we'll have another town meeting to get it approved and to figure out how to pay for it.
Any other questions, comments? Or Mr. Dimes?
Yes, Mr. Gardner-Steve. At the October 2012 meeting, you made a motion to suspend the rules so that the budget, so that the taxes, the option tax, and the police fire bond issue could be discussed together. I think it's become apparent that the budget and the police fire bond cannot be separated as issues. It's really hard. I recognize that the board is working very, very hard. I personally have been made it my own agenda to get a recognizable, a realistic salary for your positions. But with that said, I think we really have to consider, thinking out of the box, even procedurally. You could put a vote on the redirection of funds on the ballot. You could do that. And
I disagree with your understanding of the procedure, and it's not on for Monday's meeting. And Monday's meeting is to vote on the budget article, and that's what the informational meeting is about.
there is an Article 2 for other business which could be lawfully brought before the meeting.
Not a binding article, Mr. Times.
I understand this does not have to be a binding article. Anyway, I don't want to labor the point, but I think that you could discuss things with Mr. Gillies. He is an authority on statewide authority on town charter, and with Mr. Fisher.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Yes, Ms. Andrews.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gartenstein. I'm glad Dr. Tortolani got up because I felt compelled to just push the issue of the safety of the hazards going on and why the bureaucracy comes before that. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I want to thank everybody for coming out this evening. We'll be available to answer any questions you may have. We're not going to adjourn yet because we're going to have to go back into executive session, but thank you very much.